The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Akeisha Craven Howell, and I lead CMS's Office of Student Assignment and School Choice. I'm joined this evening by Marilyn Brown, who is a specialist in our Planning Services Office. We've got just over 80 people who have pre-registered for the webinar, and people are continuing to kind of trickle in. I do want to let everyone know that this webinar will be recorded, and it will be posted to the Planning Services website for anyone who would like to go back to review it, or if you know anyone who wanted the information but was unable to attend. Our objectives for this evening are threefold. First, to understand the process which we kick off today and which will ultimately lead to a board vote for the new school boundary, which we'll talk a little bit more about throughout the evening. We also want to review the opportunities that are created by this 2017 bond project, which provides for a relief elementary school in southeastern Mecklenburg County. And then finally, I'll share the intended timeline, including community engagement and next steps. Before we go any further, I do want to acknowledge that oftentimes conversations about changing student assignment are really stressful for some people. I've got elementary age students myself, and I know that we have quite an attachment to our elementary school, and I imagine that many on this call do as well. And the thought of having to change elementary schools, kind of mid-course can be really stressful and can cause a lot of tension. What we hope to do through this community engagement process is to provide as much information as possible, to include as much community input and feedback as possible toward the end of easing some of that anxiety and tension. Sometimes an unintended consequence of the community engagement is that communities within schools begin to experience tension amongst each other as it relates to who stays at the current school and who goes to the new school. And we want to try to avoid that for you as much as possible. And so if we can agree to be as objective as possible in this process and try to navigate it as a community, I think it will be easiest for everyone. One final agreement that I hope we can have for this evening's meeting is a personal one for me. I am home alone with a 5-year-old as a result of a family scheduling snafu, and at any moment she could come in this office. And so if you'll just let me address her needs, I will get back to this webinar as soon as possible. So if we can agree on that little bit of grace for me, I would really appreciate it. So let's talk about the process that starts tonight and leads up to a board vote on the new school boundary. The superintendent, through his designees, over a period of time, will gather community input and feedback. As the lead for the Office of Student Assignment and School Choice, I am his primary designee, but certainly members of our planning services team, as well as our learning communities, or other places that are happy to receive your input as well. We typically have 3 engagement sessions, and session 1, which is what we have tonight, introduces the opportunity and seeks initial input from the community on the new boundary. After that first session, our planning services team will draft at least 2 boundary scenarios that fit the needs, and we will bring those scenarios back in a second community engagement session to seek feedback on those 2 scenarios. Ideally, between a second and third community engagement meeting, we would be able to narrow the draft scenarios down to a single scenario, which would represent the superintendent's recommendation to the board. And we would preview that with the community in the third community engagement session. Sometimes after that second community engagement session, new scenarios are created based on feedback. And we need to schedule an additional meeting to review those with the community. So 3 engagement sessions is typically the minimum. but sometimes we do see a need for 4 or sometimes even 5. Throughout the process, we will be sharing your input and feedback with both the superintendent and the board. That happens at least once during a public update during a regularly scheduled board meeting where I will share an updated report to the board. We also will have at least one public hearing during a regularly scheduled board meeting. And that is an opportunity for you as community members to sign up and share your thoughts and feedback directly with the board. And I will make sure to share the dates with you for both that update and the public hearing as soon as they are scheduled. There are multiple inputs to the superintendent's recommendation and the board's vote. The first is policy JCA, which is the board's student assignment policy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail in just a moment. We've already talked about your community input. And then there's also achieving the 2017 bond goals. And for this project, the intent and the goal is to provide elementary relief. The superintendent will make his recommendation to the board for a vote in approximately the June or July timeframe. The changes will then become effective with the beginning of the 2022-23 school year. So the board will vote this summer. We will have a full summer, a full school year, and then another full summer before those changes would go into effect. And so a little bit more about student assignment policy JCA. This policy directs the superintendent and his designees relative to the board's priorities and requirements for student assignment. There's one requirement in policy JCA, and that is that all boundaries are contiguous. What that means is that anytime we draw a school's attendance boundary, it must be an unbroken line around that school. Policy JCA also identifies a decision matrix for school boundary decisions, and it identifies 4 priorities. These priorities are of equal weight, and sometimes they represent trade-offs. But the policy directs the superintendent and designees to be mindful of these 4 priorities anytime it creates a school boundary. Those are home to school distance, intact feeder patterns, which is the extent to which a group of elementary school students travels together to middle school and then high school, socioeconomic diversity. And when we talk about socioeconomic diversity, we're looking at a number of factors in CMS in addition to family income. We are looking at factors such as English language ability, family structure, parent educational attainment, and whether or not the home is owned. And all of these, when taken in aggregate, do influence the school learning environment. And then finally, we look at utilization, the extent to which a school is underutilized and so could support additional students, or overutilized in that it requires some relief. In addition to the single requirement and the 4 priorities, the policy also outlines some additional factors for consideration. These include achieving the board's goals through other means, such as establishing a partial magnet school instead of changing a school boundary. It directs the superintendent to the extent possible to keep entire neighborhoods assigned to the same school. Certainly, we want to always look at projections for population growth and demographic shifts. And then you see a couple others that are listed there as well. So this is the policy that really guides our work and is a significant factor in how we will develop those scenarios that we will ultimately bring back to you. So then when we think about the opportunity created by the 2017 bond, what you see before you is a map of a handful of our elementary schools in the southeastern part of the county. You see Bain Elementary School here, Lebanon Road Elementary, Piney Grove, Crown Point, and Matthews Elementary. The site of the relief school is on the Mint Hill Middle School campus and actually sits within the Crown Point Elementary School attendance area, such that even though the bond project calls for relief to Bain, Lebanon Road, and Piney Grove, because of the requirement that boundaries are contiguous, with the relief school sitting in the Crown Point attendance area, it necessarily means that we will have to change the Crown Point elementary school boundary as well. This is a new 45 classroom elementary school that can support up to 900 students. We'll look at a minute at some data that shows the current utilization of the elementary schools on this map. And you will see that based on the utilization of the schools that are mentioned in the 2017 bond, as well as the location of the relief school, that we have an opportunity to provide some relief to Matthews Elementary School as well. We do have a number of middle schools that are served by these elementaries, as well as a couple of high schools as well. So let's take a look at the data, and let me walk you through these tables so as to orient you. First, we have each of the elementary schools that we're talking about listed. And then we have a number that's called the planning capacity. So that planning capacity takes a look at, on average, having 20 students per classroom in an elementary school. And so the number that you see is the number of classrooms in that school multiplied by 20. You then see the number of classrooms, the number of mobile units currently in use at the school as of the 1920 school year. You then see the 2019-20 enrollment. I'm using the 1920 enrollment because enrollment in many of our schools during the 2021 school year is a bit of an anomaly, and it doesn't give you a really consistent picture of what utilization in these schools has been recently. You then see the 2019-20 number of classroom teachers, and then the 1920 capacity utilization. And so this is the ratio of classroom teachers to classrooms. It does not include the number of mobile units. And then finally, you see the 10-year projected enrollment based on the 1920 school year. I do want to point out, you see an asterisk here beside Bain, and you see a couple of numbers in parentheses. Up until the 2019-20 school year, there was a portion of Bain's facility which was not included in the classroom count. It is an older part of the facility which has 20 classrooms. And so prior to 1920, when we looked at the planning capacity for Bain, as well as the classroom utilization, we were basing that on 39 classrooms. In the year 1920, the facilities team asked us to count those 20 classrooms. And based on that, we've increased the number of classrooms to 59 and the planning capacity as well. You can see then just a quick glance at the utilization. You can see at Lebanon Road, Piney Grove, and Matthews Elementary, we have our most significant needs for relief. When I discussed the board's priority, one of the things that I discussed was socioeconomic diversity. And so you can see in the chart below the distribution of students who reside in lower socioeconomic communities, medium socioeconomic communities, and higher socioeconomic communities across each of the 5 elementary schools. I know this is a lot of data to consume during the webinar. So again, the webinar will be recorded and posted to our website, as will the slides. So typically in our first community engagement meeting, our team would come with multiple copies of maps. We would have colored markers and highlighters, And we would ask you to form small groups in the library or cafeteria, wherever we would be holding the meeting. And we'd ask you to give us feedback on those maps, the first set being a set of neighborhood maps, where for each of the school attendance areas that we are considering, we would want you to advise us as to, do we have the right neighborhoods on the map? Is there a neighborhood that's missing? Do we show on the map that the cutoff for a particular neighborhood is one street, but the neighborhood considers the cutoff another street? As we attempt to adhere to policy JCA and the request that the superintendent keep entire neighborhoods assigned to the same school, that kind of feedback from the community is very important. Because we're virtual this evening instead of together, I am going to ask that you provide that level of feedback via survey. That survey will be distributed by close of business tomorrow. It will be posted on the Planning Services website, but I am also able to email a link to that survey to everyone who registered for this webinar and did so with an email address. Embedded in the survey will be a link to neighborhood maps that you can refer to in order to respond to the survey questions. In addition to the neighborhood maps, in a first session, we would typically have you also take a look at a map and share your feedback regarding what feels like natural places to adjust existing boundaries. That can be based on major thoroughfares. It can be based on existing splits in assignment to middle school or high school. It can be based on neighborhood breaks. But we want to hear from you where you think it makes sense or what feels natural to you, aligning to board policy JCA for us to consider as we create the scenarios for these school boundaries. And so again, we will provide the maps and ask you to provide that feedback via survey. So given that, what's next? Again, that survey and the neighborhood maps will be available by close of business Tuesday. I will email that link to everyone who registered for this webinar with an email address. It will also be posted on our CMS Planning Services webpage. And I will also ask our principals to help distribute it in the ways that their respective communities are most used to receiving communication from the school. Our planning services department will take the feedback from those surveys to develop a number of scenarios. We always develop at least two, but we try to have more than that. And it will be informed by the input from those surveys. We will bring those back to you in a second community engagement session. That date is to be determined, but it will most likely be towards the end of April and early May. And again, we will communicate that date and the webinar information via our principals as well as our CMS communications department. We will have at that time an opportunity for Q&A related to the scenarios and to the process overall. In the meantime, if you have any questions, I invite you to email those to our planning services team. The email address is there at the bottom, planning@cms.k12.nc.us. And that will inform the content for our second community engagement session as well. Just wanting to make sure that we can plan content around the community's questions. I do actually see a couple of questions in the chat, which I will try to respond to now. There are a number of questions about grandfathering and what about students who would be in the 5th grade in the fall 2022 school year. Typically when we create a new school attendance area, which requires students to change schools, the superintendent's recommendation does include grandfathering, such that students who are in the terminal grade, in this case, the 5th grade, during the year when the change becomes effective, would not need to move. I see another question about a PDF of the presentation. Yes, we will post this presentation to the CMS website. If you go to cms.k12.nc.us, you will find the planning services page under departments, and the presentation, as well as a recording of the webinar and the maps that I referenced earlier, will be there. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for this kickoff session. I look forward to receiving your input via our survey, and I look forward to continuing in this process together leading up to our board's vote this summer. Thanks again. Have a good evening.